As soon as she saw me, she approached and kissed me. She placed in my hand the key to her chest, in which she said she had left for me a few trivial things as a remembrance of her stay in my house. "Whenever you open this chest," she said, "and behold the things it contains, you will, I hope, remember me and rejoice in my gladness." With these words she bade me her last farewell, and, accompanied by my son, disappeared from before my eyes. What pangs of anguish I felt that moment as I beheld her beauteous form gradually fade away in the distance. She mounted the steed which the Sardar had sent for her, and, escorted by my son and a number of attendants, who marched on each side of her, rode out to the garden that was to be the scene of her martyrdom. 3 hours later my son returned, his face drenched with tears, hurling imprecations at the Sardar and his abject lieutenants. I tried to calm his agitation, and, seating him beside me, asked him to relate as fully as he could the circumstances of her death. "Mother," he sobbingly replied, "I can scarcely attempt to describe what my eyes have beheld. We straightway proceeded to the Ilkhani garden outside the gate of the city. There I found, to my horror, the Sardar and his lieutenants absorbed in acts of debauchery and shame, flushed with wine and roaring with laughter. Arriving at the gate, Tahiri dismounted, and, calling me to her, asked me to act as her intermediary with the Sardar, whom she said she was disinclined to address in the midst of his revelry. They apparently wished to strangle me, she said. I set aside, long ago, a silken kerchief, which I hoped would be used for this purpose. I deliver it into your hands, and wish you to induce that dissolute drunkard to use it as a means whereby he can take my life." When I went to the Sardar, I found him in a state of wretched intoxication. "Interrupt not the gaiety of our festival," I heard him shout as I approached him. "Let that miserable wretch be strangled and the body be thrown into a pit." I was greatly surprised at such an order. Believing it unnecessary to venture any request from him, I went to 2 of his attendants, with whom I was already acquainted, and gave them the kerchief with which Tahiri had entrusted me. They consented to grant her request. That same kerchief was wound round her neck and was made the instrument of her martyrdom. I hastened immediately afterwards to the gardener and asked him whether he could suggest a place where I could conceal the body. He directed me, to my great delight, to a well that had been dug recently and left unfinished. With the help of a few others, I lowered her into her grave and filled the well with earth and stones in the manner she herself had wished. Those who saw her in her last moments were profoundly affected. With downcast eyes and wrapped in silence, they mournfully dispersed, leaving their victim, who had shed so imperishable a lustre upon their country, buried beneath a mass of stones which they with their own hands had heaped upon her. I wept hot tears as my son unfolded to my eyes that tragic tale. I was so overcome with emotion that I fell prostrate and unconscious upon the ground. When I had recovered, I found my son a prey to an agony no less severe than my own. He lay upon his couch, weeping in a passion of devotion. Beholding my plight, he approached and comforted me. "Your tears," he said, "will betray you in the eyes of my father. Considerations of rank and position will no doubt induce him to forsake us and sever whatever ties bind him to this home. He will, if we fail to repress our tears, accuse us before Nasir-ed-Din Shah as victims of the charm of a hateful enemy. He will obtain the sovereign's consent to our death, and will probably with his own hands proceed to slay us. Why should we, who have never embraced that cause, allow ourselves to suffer such a fate at his hands? All we should do is to defend her against those who denounce her as the very negation of chastity and honor. We should ever treasure her love in our hearts, and maintain, in the face of a slanderous enemy, the integrity of that life." His words allayed my inner agitation. I went to her chest, and with the key she had placed in my hand, opened it. I found a small vial of the choicest perfume, beside which lay a rosary, a coral necklace, and 3 rings mounted with turquoise, cornelian, and ruby stones. As I gazed upon her earthly belongings, I mused over the circumstances of her eventful life, and recalled, with a throb of wonder, her intrepid courage, her zeal, a high sense of duty, and unquestioning devotion. I was reminded of her literal attainments, and brooded over the imprisonments, the shame, and the calumny which she had faced with a fortitude such as no other woman in her land could manifest. I pictured to myself that winsome face which now, alas, lay buried beneath a mass of earth and stones. The memory of her passionate eloquence warmed my heart as I repeated to myself the words that had so often dropped from her lips. The consciousness of the vastness of her knowledge and her mastery of the sacred scriptures of Islam flashed through my mind with a suddenness that disconcerted me. Above all, her passionate loyalty to the faith she had embraced, her fervour as she pleaded its cause, the services she rendered it, the woes and tribulations she endured for its sake, the example she had given to its followers, the impetus she had lent to its advancement, the name she carved for herself in the hearts of her fellow countrymen, all these I remembered as I stood beside her chest, wondering what could have induced so great a woman to forsake all the riches and honours with which she had been surrounded, and to identify herself with the cause of an obscure youth from Shiraz. What could have been the secret, I thought to myself, of the power that tore her away from her home and kindred, that sustained her throughout her stormy career, and eventually carried her to her grave? Could that force, I pondered, be of God? Could the hand of the Almighty have guided her destiny and steered her course amidst the perils of her life? On the third day after her martyrdom, August A.D. 1852, the woman whose coming she had promised arrived. I inquired her name, and finding it to be the same as the one Tahiri had told me, delivered into her hands the package with which I had been entrusted. I had never before met that woman, nor did I ever see her again. The name of that immortal woman was Fatime, a name which her father had bestowed upon her. She was surnamed I Salmi by her family and kindred, who also designated her as Zakiye. She was born in the year A.H. 1233, A.D. 1817 to 18, the very year which witnessed the birth of Baha'u'llah. She was 36 years of age when she suffered martyrdom in Tehran. May future generations be able to present a worthy account of a life which her contemporaries have failed adequately to recognize. May future historians perceive the full measure of her influence and record the unique services this great woman has rendered to her land and its people. May the followers of the faith which she served so well strive to follow her example, recount her deeds, collect her writings, unfold the secret of her talents, and establish her for all time in the memory and affections of the peoples and kindreds of the earth. And a footnote here says, beauty and the female sex also lent their consecration to the new creed, and the heroism of the lovely but ill-fated poetess of Qazvin, Zarin, Taj, Crown of Gold, or Qurratul Ain, Solace of the Eyes, who, throwing off the veil, carried the missionary torch far and wide, is one of the most affecting episodes in modern history. From Lord Curzon's Persia and the Persian Question, Volume 1, page 497, Note 2. No memory is more deeply venerated or kindles greater enthusiasm than hers, and the influence which she wielded in her lifetime still inures to her sex. From Valentine Chirol's The Middle Eastern Question, page 124. The appearance of such a woman as Qurratul Ain is in any country in any age a rare phenomenon, but in such a country as Persia it is a prodigy, nay, almost a miracle. Alike in virtue of her marvellous beauty, her rare intellectual gifts, her fervid eloquence, her fearless devotion, and her glorious martyrdom, she stands forth incomparable and immortal amidst her countrywomen. Had the Baha'i religion no other claim to greatness, this was sufficient, that it produced a heroine like Qurratul Ain. From A Traveller's Narrative, Note Q, page 309. Almost the most remarkable figure in the whole movement was the poetess Qurratul Ain. She was known for her virtues, piety, and learning, and had been finally converted on reading some of the verses and exhortations of the Bab. So strong in her faith did she become, that although she was both rich and noble, she gave up wealth, child, name, and position for her master's service, and set herself to proclaim and establish his doctrine. The beauty of her speech was such as to draw guests from a marriage feast rather than listen to the music provided by the host, and her verses were among the most stirring in the Persian language. From Sir Francis Younghusband's The Gleam, page 203. Another distinguished figure among the disciples of the Bab who met his death during the turbulent time that had overwhelmed Tehran was Syed Hussein I Yazdi, who was the Bab's amanuensis both in Maku and Chirik. Such was his knowledge of the teachings of the faith that the Bab, in a tablet addressed to Mirza Yahya, urged the latter to seek enlightenment from him in whatever might pertain to the sacred writings. A man of standing and experience, in whom the Bab reposed the utmost confidence, and with whom he had been intimately associated, he suffered, after the martyrdom of his master in Tabriz, the agony of a long confinement in the subterranean dungeon of Tehran, which confinement terminated in his martyrdom. To a very great extent, Baha'u'llah helped to allay the hardships from which he suffered. Regularly, every month, Baha'u'llah sent him whatever financial assistance he required. He was praised and admired even by the jailers who watched over him. His long and intimate companionship with the Bab during the last and stormiest days of his life had deepened his understanding and endowed his soul with a power which he was destined to manifest more and more as the days of his earthly life drew near to their close. He lay in the prison, longing for the time when he should be called upon to suffer a death similar to that of his master. Deprived of the privilege of being martyred on the same day as the Bab, a privilege which it had been his supreme desire to attain, he now eagerly awaited the hour when he, in his turn, should drain to the very dregs the cup that had touched his lips. Many a time did the leading officials of Tehran strive to induce him to accept their offer to deliver him from the rigors of his imprisonment, as well as from the prospect of a still more cruel death. He steadfastly refused. Tears flowed unceasingly from his eyes, tears born of his longing to see again that face whose radiance had shone so brightly amidst the darkness of a cruel incarceration in Azerbaijan, and whose glow warmed the chill of its wintry nights. As he mused in the gloom of his prison cell over those blissful days spent in the presence of his master, there came to him one who alone could banish, by the light of his presence, the anguish that had settled upon his soul. His comforter was none other than Baha'u'llah himself. In his company, Syed Hussein was privileged to remain until the hour of his death. The hand of Aziz Khan-i Sardar, which had struck down Tahiri, was the hand that dealt the fatal blow to the Bab's amanuensis and sometime fellow prisoner in Azerbaijan. I need not expatiate upon the circumstances of the death which that murderous Sardar inflicted upon him. Suffice it to say that he too, like those who went before, drank, in circumstances of shameful cruelty, the cup for which he had so long and deeply yearned. I now proceed to relate what befell the remaining companions of the Bab, those who had been privileged to share the horrors of the confinement with Baha'u'llah. From his own lips I have often heard the following account. All those who were struck down by the storm that raged during that memorable year in Tehran were our fellow prisoners in the Siyah, where we were confined. We were all huddled together in one cell, our feet in stocks, and around our necks fastened the most galling of chains. The air we breathed was laden with the foulest impurities, while the floor on which we sat was covered with filth and infested with vermin. No ray of light was allowed to penetrate that pestilential dungeon or to warm its icy coldness. We were placed in 2 rows, each facing the other. We had taught them to repeat certain verses which every night they chanted with extreme fervor. God is sufficient unto me, he verily is the all-sufficing, one row would intone, while the other would reply, in him let the trusting trust. The chorus of these gladsome voices would continue to peal out until the early hours of the morning. Their reverberation would fill the dungeon, and, piercing its massive walls, would reach the ears of Nasir-ed-Din Shah, whose palace was not far distant from the place where we were imprisoned. What means this sound? He was reported to have exclaimed. It is the anthem the Babis are intoning in their prison, they replied. The Shah made no further remarks, nor did he attempt to restrain the enthusiasm his prisoners, despite the horrors of their confinement, continued to display. One day there was brought to our prison a tray of roasted meat, which they informed us the Shah had ordered to be distributed amongst the prisoners. The Shah, we were told, faithful to a vow he made, has chosen this day to offer to you all this lamb in fulfillment of his pledge." A deep silence fell upon our companions, who expected us to make answer on their behalf. "We return this gift to you," we replied. "We can well dispense with this offer." The answer we made would have greatly irritated the guards had they not been eager to devour the food we had refused to touch. Despite the hunger with which our companions were afflicted, only one among them, a certain Mirza Hussein-i Mutawalli-i Kumi, showed any desire to eat of the food the sovereign had spread before us. With a fortitude that was truly heroic, our fellow prisoners submitted without a murmur to endure the piteous plight to which they were reduced. Praise to God, instead of complaint to the treatment meted out to them by the Shah, fell unceasingly from their lips praise with which they sought to beguile the hardships of a cruel captivity. Every day our jailers, entering our cell, would call the name of one of our companions, bidding him arise and follow them to the foot of the gallows. With what eagerness would the owner of that name respond to that solemn call! Relieved of his chains, he would spring to his feet, and in a state of uncontrollable delight would approach and embrace us. We would seek to comfort him with the assurance of an everlasting life in the world beyond, and filling his heart with hope and joy, would send him forth to win the crown of glory. He would embrace in turn the rest of his fellow prisoners, and then proceed to die as dauntlessly as he had lived. Soon after the martyrdom of each of these companions, we would be informed by the executioner, who had grown to be friendly with us, of the circumstances of the death of his victim, and of the joy with which he had endured his sufferings to the very end. We were awakened one night ere break of day by Mirza Abdul Wahab-i Shirazi, who was bound with us to the same chains. He had left Kazimane and followed us to Tehran, where he was arrested and thrown into prison. He asked us whether we were awake, and proceeded to relate to us his dream. "I have this night," he said, "been soaring into a space of infinite vastness and beauty. I seemed to be uplifted on wings that carried me wherever I desired to go. A feeling of rapturous delight filled my soul. I flew in the midst of that immensity with a swiftness and ease that I cannot describe. Today," we replied, "it will be your turn to sacrifice yourself for this cause. May you remain firm and steadfast to the end. You will then find yourself soaring in that same limitless space of which you dreamed, traversing with the same ease and swiftness the realm of immortal sovereignty, and gazing with that same rapture upon the infinite horizon." That morning saw the jailer again enter our cell and call out the name of Abul Wahab. Throwing off his chains, he sprang to his feet, embraced each one of his fellow prisoners, and taking us into his arms, pressed us lovingly to his heart. That moment we discovered that he had no shoes to wear. We gave him our own, and speaking a last word of encouragement and cheer, sent him forth to the scene of his martyrdom. Later on his executioner came to us, praising in glowing language the spirit which that youth had shown. How thankful we were to God for this testimony which the executioner himself had given. All this suffering and the cruel revenge the authorities had taken on those who had attempted the life of the sovereign failed to appease the anger of the Shah's mother. Day and night she persisted in her vindictive clamor, demanding the execution of Baha'u'llah, whom she still regarded as the real author of the crime. "Deliver him to the executioners," she insistently cried to the authorities. "What greater humiliation than this, that I, who am the mother of the Shah, should be powerless to inflict upon that criminal the punishment so dastardly an act deserves?" Her cry for vengeance, which an impotent rage served to intensify, was doomed to remain unanswered. Despite her machinations, Baha'u'llah was saved from the fate she had so importunately striven to precipitate. The prisoner was eventually released from his confinement, and was able to unfold and establish beyond the confines of the kingdom of her son a sovereignty, the possibility of which she could never even have dreamed of. The blood shed in the course of that fateful year in Tehran by that heroic band with whom Baha'u'llah had been imprisoned was the ransom paid for his deliverance from the hand of a foe that sought to prevent him from achieving the purpose for which God had destined him. Ever since the time he espoused the cause of the Bab, He had never neglected one single occasion to champion the faith he had embraced. He had exposed himself to the perils which the followers of the faith had to face in its early days. He was the first of the Bab's disciples to set the example of renunciation and service to the cause. Yet his life, beset as it was by the risks and dangers that a career such as his was sure to encounter, was spared by that same Providence who had chosen him for a task which he, in his wisdom, deemed it as yet too soon to proclaim publicly. The terror that convulsed Tehran was but one of the many risks and dangers to which Baha'u'llah's life was exposed. Men, women, and children in the capital trembled at the ruthlessness with which the enemy pursued their victims. A youth named Abbas, a former servant of Haji Suleiman Khan, and fully informed, owing to the wide circle of friends whom his master cultivated, of the names, the number, and the dwelling places of the Bab's disciples, was employed by the enemy as an instrument ready to hand for the prosecution of its designs. He had identified himself with the faith of his master, and regarded himself as one of its zealous supporters. At the outset of the turmoil, he was arrested and compelled to betray all those whom he knew to be associated with the faith. They sought by every manner of reward to induce him to reveal those who were his master's fellow disciples, and warned him that, should he refuse to disclose their names, he would be subjected to inhuman tortures. He pledged his word that he would act according to their wishes, and would inform the assistants of Haji Ali Khan, the Haji Bud Dawli, the Farash Bashi, of their names and abodes. He was taken through the streets of Tehran, and directed to point out everyone he recognized as being a follower of the Bab. A number of people whom he had never met and known were in this manner delivered into the hands of Haji Ali Khan's assistants, people who had never had any connection with the Bab and his cause. These were able to recover their freedom only after having paid a heavy bribe to those who had captured them. Such was the greed of the Haji Bud Dawli's attendants that they specially requested Abbas to salute, as a sign of betrayal, every person who he thought would be willing and able to pay large sums for his deliverance. They would even force him to betray such persons, threatening that his refusal would be fraught with grave danger to his own life. They would frequently promise to give him a share of the money they determined to extort from their victims. This Abbas was taken to the Seer Shah and introduced to Baha'u'llah, whom he had met previously on several occasions in the company of his master, in the hope that he would betray him. They promised that the mother of the Shah would amply reward him for such a betrayal. Every time he was taken into Baha'u'llah's presence, Abbas, after standing a few moments before him and gazing upon his face, would leave the place, emphatically denying ever having seen him. Having failed in their effort, they resorted to poison in the hope of obtaining the favor of the mother of their sovereign. They were able to intercept the food that their prisoner, Baha'u'llah, was permitted to receive from his home, and mixed with it the poison they hoped would be fatal to him. This measure, though impairing the health of Baha'u'llah for years, failed to achieve its purpose. The enemy was finally induced to cease regarding him, Baha'u'llah, as the prime mover of that attempt, and decided to transfer the responsibility for this act to Azim, whom they now accused of being the real author of the crime. By this means they endeavored to obtain the favor of the mother of the Shah, a favor they greatly coveted. Haji Ali Khan was only too happy to second their efforts. As he himself had taken no share in imprisoning Baha'u'llah, he seized upon the occasion which offered itself to denounce Azim, whom he had already succeeded in arresting, as the chief and responsible instigator. The Russian minister, who, through one of his agents, was watching the developments of the situation and keeping in close touch with the condition of Baha'u'llah, addressed, through his interpreter, a strongly worded message to the Grand Vizier, in which he protested against his action, suggesting that a messenger should proceed in the company of one of the government's trusted representatives and of Haji Bud Dawli to the Seer Shah, and there ask the newly recognized leader to declare publicly his opinion regarding Baha'u'llah's position. Whatever that leader may declare, he wrote, whether in praise or denunciation, I think ought to be immediately recorded and should serve as a basis for the final judgment which should be pronounced in this affair. The Grand Vizier promised the interpreter that he would follow the minister's advice, and even appointed a time for the messenger to join the government representative and Haji Bud Dawle and proceed with them to the Seer Shah. When Azim was questioned as to whether he regarded Baha'u'llah as the responsible leader of the group that had made the attempt on the Shah's life, he answered, "The leader of this community was none other than the Seyyid Ibab, who was slain in Tabriz, and whose martyrdom induced me to arise and avenge his death. I alone conceived this plan and endeavored to execute it. The youth who threw the Shah from his horse was none other than Sadiq-i Tabrizi, a servitor of a confectioner's shop in Tehran, who had been for 2 years in my service. He was fired with a desire even more burning than my own to avenge the martyrdom of his leader. He acted too hastily, however, and failed to make certain the success of his attempt." The words of his declaration were taken down by both the minister's interpreter and the Grand Vizier's representative, who submitted their records to Mirza Akka Khan. The documents, which were placed in his hands, were chiefly responsible for Baha'u'llah's release from his imprisonment. Azim was accordingly delivered into the hands of the ulamas, who, though themselves anxious to hasten his death, were prevented by the hesitancy of Mirza Abul Qasim, the Imam Jumi of Tehran. Haji Bud Dawle, because of the near approach of the month of Muharram, induced the ulamas to assemble on the upper floor of the barracks, where he succeeded in obtaining the presence of the Imam Jumi, who still persisted in his refusal to consent to the death of Azim. He directed that the accused be brought to that place, and there await the judgment that was to be pronounced against him. He was roughly conducted through the streets, overwhelmed with ridicule and reviled by the populace. Through a subtle device which the enemy had contrived, they succeeded in obtaining a verdict for death. A Seyyid, armed with a club, rushed at him and smashed his head. His example was followed by the people, who, with sticks, stones, and daggers, fell upon him and mutilated his body. Haji Mirza Jani also was among those who suffered martyrdom in the course of the agitation that followed the attempt on the life of the Shah. Owing to the disinclination of the Grand Vizier to harm him, he was secretly put to death. The conflagration kindled in the capital spread to the adjoining provinces, bringing in its wake devastation and misery to countless innocent people among the subjects of the Shah. It ravaged Mazindaran, the home of Baha'u'llah, and was the signal for acts of violence which were directed mainly against all his possessions in that province. 2 of the Bab's devoted disciples, Muhammad Taqi Khan and Abdul Wahab, both residents of Nur, suffered martyrdom as the result of that turmoil. The enemies of the faith, finding to their disappointment that Baha'u'llah's deliverance from prison was almost assured, sought, by intimidating their sovereign, to involve him, Baha'u'llah, in fresh complications and thus encompass his death. The folly of Mirza Yahya, who, driven by his idle hopes, had sought to secure for himself and the band of his foolish supporters a supremacy which hitherto he had in vain laboured to obtain, served as a further pretext for the enemy to urge the Shah to take drastic measures for the destruction of whatever influence his prisoner still retained in Mazindaran. The alarming reports received by the Shah, who had scarcely recovered from his wounds, stirred in him a terrible thirst for revenge. He summoned the Grand Vizier and reprimanded him for having failed to maintain order and discipline among the people of his own province, who were bound to him by ties of kinship. Disconcerted by the rebuke of his sovereign, he expressed his readiness to fulfill whatever he would direct him to do. He was bidden dispatch immediately to that province several regiments, with strict orders to repress with a ruthless hand the disturbers of the public peace. The Grand Vizier, though fully aware of the exaggerated character of the reports that had been submitted to him, found himself compelled, owing to the Shah's insistence, to order the dispatch of the Shah Sun regiment, headed by Hussein Ali Khan-i Shah Sun, to the village of Takur in the district of Nur, where the home of Baha'u'llah was situated. He gave the supreme command into the hands of his nephew, Mirza Abu Talib Khan, brother-in-law of Mirza Hassan, who was Baha'u'llah's half-brother. Mirza Akka Khan urged him to exercise the utmost caution and restraint while encamping in that village. Whatever excesses, they urged him, are committed by your men will react unfavorably on the prestige of Mirza Hassan and be the cause of affliction to your own sister. He bade him investigate the nature of these reports, and not to encamp more than 3 days in the vicinity of that village. The Grand Vizier afterwards summoned Hussein Ali Khan, and exhorted him to conduct himself with the utmost circumspection and wisdom. Mirza Abu Talib, he said, is still young and inexperienced. I have specially chosen him owing to his kinship to Mirza Hassan. I trust that he will, for the sake of his sister, refrain from causing unnecessary injury to the inhabitants of Takur. Being superior to him in age and experience, you must set him a noble example, and impress on him the necessity of serving the interests of both government and people. You must never allow him to undertake any operations without having previously consulted with you. He assured Hussein Ali Khan that he had issued written instructions to the chieftains of that district, calling upon them to come to his assistance whenever required. Mirza Abu Talib Khan, flushed with pride and enthusiasm, forgot the counsels of moderation the Grand Vizier had given him. He refused to be influenced by the pressing appeals of Hussein Ali Khan, who entreated him not to provoke an unnecessary conflict with the people. No sooner had he reached the pass which divided the district of Nur from the adjoining province, which was not far distant from Takur, than he ordered his men to prepare for attack upon the people of the village. Hussein Ali Khan ran to him in despair and begged him to refrain from such an act. "It is for me," Mirza Abu Talib haughtily retorted, "who am your superior, to decide what measures should be taken and in what manner I should serve my sovereign." A sudden attack was launched upon the defenseless people of Takur. Surprised by so unexpected and fierce an onslaught, they appealed to Mirza Hassan, who asked to be introduced into the presence of Mirza Abu Talib, but was refused admittance. "Tell him," was the commander's message, "that I am charged by my sovereign to order a wholesale massacre of the people of this village, to capture its women and confiscate its property. For your sake, however, I am willing to spare such women as take refuge in your house." Mirza Hassan, indignant at this refusal, severely censured him, and, denouncing the action of the Shah, returned to his home. The men of that village had meanwhile left their dwellings and sought refuge in the neighboring mountains. Their women, abandoned to their fate, betook themselves to the home of Mirza Hassan, whom they implored to protect them from the enemy. The first act of Mirza Abu Talib Khan was directed against the house of Baha'u'llah, which Baha'u'llah had inherited from the Vizier, his father, and of which he was the sole possessor. That house had been royally furnished and was decorated with vessels of inestimable value. He ordered his men to break open all its treasuries and to take away their contents. Such things as he was unable to carry away he ordered to be destroyed. Some were shattered, others were burned. Even the rooms, which were more stately than those of the palaces of Tehran, were disfigured beyond repair. The beams were burned down, and the decorations utterly ruined. He next turned to the houses of the people, which he levelled with the ground, appropriating to himself and his men whatever valuables they contained. The entire village, despoiled and deserted by its men inhabitants, was delivered to the flames. Not able to find any able-bodied men, he ordered that a search be conducted in the neighbouring mountains. Any who were found were to be either shot or captured. All they could lay hands upon were a few aged men and shepherds who had been unable to proceed further afield in their flight from the enemy. They discovered 2 men lying in the distance on the slopes of a mountain beside a running brook. Their weapons, gleaming under the rays of the sun, had betrayed them. Finding them asleep, they shot them both from across the brook which intervened between the assailants and their victims. They recognized them as Abdul Wahab and Muhammad Taqi Khan. The former was shot dead, while the latter was severely wounded. They were carried into the presence of Mirza Abu Talib, who did his best to preserve the life of the victim, whom he wished, owing to his far-famed courage, to take with him to Tehran as a trophy of his victory. His efforts failed, however, for Muhammad Taqi Khan 2 days later died from his wounds. A few men they had been able to capture were led in chains to Tehran and thrown into the same underground dungeon where Baha'u'llah had been confined. Among them was Mullah Ali Baba, who, together with a number of his fellow prisoners, perished in that dungeon as a result of the hardships he had endured. The year after, this same Mirza Abu Talib was stricken with plague and taken in a state of wretched misery to Shimiran. Shunned by even his nearest kindred, He lay on his sick-bed until this same Mirza Hassan, whom he had so haughtily insulted, offered to tend his sores and bear him company in his days of humiliation and loneliness. He was on the brink of death when the Grand Vizier visited him and found none at his bedside but the one whom he had so rudely treated. That very day that wretched tyrant expired, bitterly disappointed at the failure of all the hopes he had fondly cherished. The commotion that had seized Tehran, the effects of which had been severely felt in Nur and the surrounding district, spread as far as Yazd and Neriz, where a considerable number of the Bab's disciples were seized and inhumanly martyred. The whole of Persia seemed indeed to have felt the shock of that great convulsion. Its tide swept as far as the remotest hamlets of the distant provinces and brought in its wake untold sufferings to the remnants of a persecuted community. Governors, no less than their subordinates, inflamed with greed and revenge, seized the occasion to enrich themselves and obtain the favor of their sovereign. Without mercy, moderation, or shame, they employed any means, however base and lawless, to extort from the innocent the benefits they themselves coveted. Forsaking every principle of justice and decency, they arrested, imprisoned, and tortured whomsoever they suspected of being a Babi, and would hasten to inform Nasir-ed-Din Shah in Tehran of the victories achieved over a detested opponent. In Neriz, the full effects of that turmoil revealed themselves in the treatment accorded by its rulers and people to the followers of the Bab. About 2 months after the attempt on the life of the Shah, a young man named Mirza Ali, whose exceptional courage had earned for him the surname of Ali-i-Sadar, distinguished himself by the extreme solicitude he extended to the survivors of the struggle which ended with the death of Wahid and his supporters. He was often seen in the darkness of night to emerge from his shelter, carrying whatever aid was in his power to the widows and orphans who had suffered from the consequences of that tragedy. To those in need he distributed food and garments with noble generosity, tended their injuries, and comforted them in their sorrow. The sight of the continuous sufferings of these innocent ones stirred the fierce indignation of some of Mirza Ali's companions, who undertook to wreak their vengeance upon Zainul Abidin Khan, who was still dwelling in Neriz, and whom they regarded as the author of their misfortunes. Believing that he had still in his heart a desire to subject them to even further afflictions, they determined to take his life. They surprised him in the public bath, where they succeeded in accomplishing their purpose. This led to an upheaval that recalled in its concluding stages the horror of the butcheries of Zanjan. Zainul Abidin Khan's widow pressed Mirza Naim, who held the reins of authority in his grasp and was then residing in Shiraz, to avenge the blood of her husband, promising that she would in return bestow all her jewels upon him and would transfer to his name whatever he might desire of her possessions. Through treachery, the authorities succeeded in capturing a considerable number of the Bab's followers, many of whom were savagely beaten. All were thrown into prison pending the receipt of instructions from Tehran. The Grand Vizier submitted the list of names he had received, together with the report that accompanied it, to the Shah, who expressed his extreme satisfaction at the success that had attended the efforts of his representative in Shiraz, and whom he amply rewarded for his signal service. He asked that all those who were captured be brought to the capital. I shall not attempt to record the various circumstances that led to the carnage which marked the termination of that episode. I would refer my readers to the graphic and detailed account which Mirza Shafi-i Nerizi has written in a separate booklet, in which he refers with accuracy and force to every detail of that moving event. Suffice it to say that no less than 180 of the Bab's valiant disciples suffered martyrdom. A like number were wounded and, though incapacitated by their injuries, were ordered to leave for Tehran. Only 28 persons among them survived the hardships of the journey to the capital. Of these 28, 15 were taken to the gallows on the very day of their arrival. The rest were thrown into prison and made to suffer for 2 years the most horrible atrocities. Though eventually released, many of them perished on the way to their homes, exhausted by the trials of a long and cruel captivity. A large number of their fellow disciples were slain in Shiraz by order of Tahmasp Mirza. The heads of 200 of these victims were placed on bayonets and carried triumphantly by their oppressors to Abadi, a village in Fars. They were intending to take them to Tehran when a royal messenger commanded them to abandon their project, whereupon they decided to bury their heads in that village. As for the women, who were 600 in number, half of them were released in Neyriz, while the rest were carried, each two being forced to ride together on an unsaddled horse, to Shiraz, where, after being submitted to severe tortures, they were abandoned to their fate. Many perished on their way to that city. Many yielded up their lives to the afflictions they were made to endure ere they recovered their freedom. My pen shrinks in horror in attempting to describe what befell those valiant men and women who were made to suffer so severely for their faith. The wanton barbarity that characterized the treatment meted out to them reached the lowest depths of infamy in the concluding stages of that lamentable episode. What I have attempted to recount of the horrors of the siege of Zanjan, of the indignities heaped upon Hujat and his supporters, pales before the glaring ferocity of the atrocities perpetrated a few years later in Neyriz and Shiraz. A pen abler than mine to describe in all their tragic details these unspeakable savageries will, I trust, be found to place on record a tale which, however grim its features, must ever remain as one of the noblest evidences of the faith which the cause of the Bab was able to inspire in his followers. The confession of Azim freed Baha'u'llah from the danger to which his life had been exposed. The circumstances of the death of him who had declared himself the chief instigator of that crime served to abate the wrath with which an enraged populace clamoured for the immediate punishment of so daring an attempt. The cries of rage and vengeance, the appeals for immediate retribution which had hitherto been focused on Baha'u'llah, were now diverted from him. The ferocity of those clamant denunciations was by degrees much allayed. The conviction grew firmer in the minds of the responsible authorities in Tehran that Baha'u'llah, hitherto regarded as the arch-foe of Nasir-ed-Din Shah, was by no means involved in any conspiracy against the sovereign's life. Mirza Akka Khan was therefore encouraged to send his trusted representative, a man named Haji Ali, to the Seershal, and to present the order for his release to the prisoner. Upon his arrival, the sight which the emissary beheld filled him with grief and surprise. The spectacle which met his eyes was one he could scarcely believe. He wept as he saw Baha'u'llah chained to a floor which was infested with vermin, his neck weighed down by galling chains, his face laden with sorrow, ungroomed and dishevelled, breathing the pestilential atmosphere of the most terrible of dungeons. "Accursed be Mirza Akka Khan!" he burst forth as his eyes recognized Baha'u'llah and the gloom that surrounded him. "God knows I had never imagined that you could have been subjected to so humiliating a captivity. I should never have thought that the Grand Vizier could have dared commit so heinous an act." He removed the mantle from his shoulders and presented it to Baha'u'llah, entreating him to wear it when in the presence of the minister and his councillors. Baha'u'llah refused his request, and, wearing the dress of a prisoner, proceeded straightway to the seat of the imperial government. The first word the Grand Vizier was moved to address to his captive was the following: "Had you chosen to take my advice, and had you dissociated yourself from the faith of the Sayyidi Bab, you would never have suffered the pains and indignities that have been heaped upon you." "Had you, in your turn," Baha'u'llah replied, "followed my counsels, the affairs of the government would not have reached so critical a stage." He was immediately reminded of the conversation he had had with Baha'u'llah on the occasion of the Bab's martyrdom. The words, "The flame that has been kindled will blaze forth more fiercely than ever," flashed through the mind of Mirza Akka Khan. "The warning you have uttered," he remarked, "has, alas, been fulfilled. What is it that you advise me now to do?" "Command the governors of the realm," was the instant reply, "to cease shedding the blood of the innocent, to cease plundering their property, to cease dishonoring their women and injuring their children. Let them cease the persecution of the faith of the Bab. Let them abandon the idle hope of wiping out his followers." The same day orders were given through a circular addressed to all the governors of the realm, bidding them to desist from their acts of cruelty and shame. "What you have done is enough," Mirza Akka Khan wrote them. "Cease arresting and punishing the people. Disturb no longer the peace and tranquillity of your countrymen." The Shah's government had been deliberating as to the most effective measures that should be taken to rid the country once and for all of the curse with which it had been afflicted. No sooner had Baha'u'llah recovered his freedom than the decision of the government was handed to him, informing him that within a month of the issuing of this order, he with his family was expected to leave Tehran for a place beyond the confines of Persia. The Russian minister, as soon as he learned of the action which the government contemplated taking, volunteered to take Baha'u'llah under his protection and invited him to go to Russia. He refused the offer and chose instead to leave for Iraq. 9 months after his return from Karbala, on the first day of the month of Rabi'ul Thani in the year AH 1269, 12th of January AD 1853, Baha'u'llah, accompanied by the members of his family, among whom were the most great branch, Abdul-Baha, and Akhe-i-Kalim, Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, Abdul-Baha's sister, then a child of 7 years of age, also accompanied the exiles, and escorted by a member of the imperial bodyguard and an official representing the Russian legation, set out from Tehran on his journey to Baghdad.